In times of austerity, it's the bloated elephant in the room that no one seems to want to tackle. Yeah, I'm talking about the Pentagon budget. A new survey shows that the public is ready for some deep cuts. An overwhelming majority from both parties support cutting the defense budget. Here's a look at that survey. 2/3 of Republicans support slashing funding, and 9 in 10 Democrats are singing the same tune. But this seems to be at odds with political leaders, with the headlines saying it all. Take a look. House passes bill undoing defense cuts. House GOP pits Pentagon versus the poor. And House votes to spare Pentagon from automatic budget cuts, trims domestic programs instead. So why is it that elected leaders and the American people don't see eye to eye when it comes to defense spending? To talk about this, I'm joined by retired Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Hey, Douglas. So it seems like everyone across the board can agree that we need to cut the Pentagon. Why is it that the Pentagon is not being cut?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. First, this sort of support for bloated defense spending has been eroding for some time. The American people have simply walked away from these interventions. So this new data is not surprising. But there's a second problem, and that is that defense spending doesn't necessarily equate to real military capability. Defense spending is really involved with a lot of redistribution of taxpayer income to various states and districts across the country. So while collectively people say, by all means, cut defense, when you begin to look at what's likely to go away, people say, well, wait a minute, that's going to cost me my job, I'm not going to get reelected, I will lose money in my district, in my state, and so that's the real rub at this point.
I mean, isn't this just a vicious cycle, though? It's like Democrats don't want to appear weak on national security, so they have to keep saying, we're strong on national security. They can't appear weak. And then you have the Republicans. Mitt Romney doesn't really have national service in his family, so he's like putting forward all of these crazy, increases to the military. I mean, how is this ever going to end if it's just going to continue to grow and grow unabated, it seems?
Well, here's some good news, frankly. It's going to end, and it's going to end over the next 2 to 3 years very profoundly, because we're headed into a severe economic crisis. What's begun in the Eurozone, what's beginning to happen in Greece, which is on the road to default, whether it happens in the near term or it's postponed for another few months, is going to reach the United States. We're going to watch the Eurozone implode. We're going to watch the UK go down. The United States will have problems. And by the way, we're going to see these problems in China, Korea, and Japan for all sorts of different reasons, but they're related in terms of the fiscal crisis. When that happens, no one in the United States is going to care, quite frankly, about the size of the defense budget. And that, in my judgment, is a real danger, because how we cut defense matters. We have very critical capabilities we need to preserve, and then we need to build capabilities for the future. And you're talking about a $300 billion defense budget, a $250 billion annual cut that's very probable over the next couple of years.
Well, you have Pentagon officials saying, they're kind of whining and crying about these proposed $55 billion. I mean, it's minuscule compared to the whole cuts. But I mean, let's talk a little bit out of the box here and look at the threat at large. I mean, you're more likely of dying in a lightning strike or suffocating accidentally in bed than you are a terrorist attack in this country. So why is this, I mean, these endless wars and just this perpetual threat of terrorism being pushed on us?
You're asking a question for which there's a complex answer. First of all, the American people have enjoyed such prosperity and good fortune for the last 35, 40 years that they really haven't paid a great deal of attention to what is done with their money in Washington. That applies to many, many things, but it also applies to defense and foreign policy. And when politicians stood up and said, oh, we have this terrible threat, we're compelled to intervene, we're compelled to bomb, and by the way, we're bringing everyone liberal democracy, human rights, and freedom, the average American said, well, all right, it's reasonable, it doesn't affect me, it's not my problem. Well, it's become his problem. We're broke. We've lost trillions of dollars on these interventions. They were not what they were advertised. They've been an enormous waste of time, money, resources, and blood. Blood, our blood, and everybody else's blood. So we're going to get out. We're going to deal with the defense spending issue because it's the biggest discretionary funding problem for the United States. However, it's not going to solve our larger economic problems. It's not going to deal with the entitlements and with the domestic requirements that we have to face up to. That's what's happening in Europe. It's the collapse of this very lucrative welfare state. We can't keep it up. The Europeans can't keep it up. It's going to produce dramatic change inside our country. So you're right. There is no existential military threat overseas. We don't need to be everywhere in the world. We're going to scale back. We're going to cut back from the outside in. And then we're going to deal with our own problems at home.
I mean, here we see that the F-35, these fighter jets, are a perfect example of the Pentagon just buying these outrageous toys that will exceed the GDP of Spain. I mean, a proposed $1.5 trillion program.
Again,
here.
the F-35 is tied to many different things that are unrelated necessarily to defense. First of all, there are a lot of jobs involved in a lot of states. There's an investment in the technology. There's a market overseas for this capability if we can sell it. So as long as those things persist, the F-35 will die a very, very slow and painful death. Again, for the reasons that I said at the beginning, it's not just about defense. It's not just about threats that no longer exist. It's also about domestic interests.
What about now Obama is pretty much a war president? I mean, he has these targeted assassination campaigns abroad, now drone wars. Once you have both sides of the coin, when we're presented with really two options, I mean, and they keep pushing endless war based on this kind of non-existent threat that you were talking about, what do we do? I mean, do we just hope that Congress will eventually cut these programs or cut the budget?
The crisis that's coming will turn over the leadership in Washington over the next 2 to 3 years. You're seeing that happen now in Europe. And you're going to see many turnovers until there are people in power with authority who are going to be accountable to the American people. That's what the Europeans want. That's what we want. It's going to take us a long time to get there, but those things will solve this problem.
And, you know, looking at what the Pentagon's rhetoric is about how even shaving off $55 billion will compromise our national security. But then you look at the budget, I mean, it's almost doubled since 9/11. I mean, were we really that unsafe before 9/11?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that we weren't. And today, if you look at real threats to the United States, to the American people, to our society, you've really got to look at Mexico. 40,000 people have been killed in Mexico over the last couple of years. The drug trade in the United States is bound up with illegal immigration. Our borders are not secure. These are much bigger issues for Americans than anything happening in Afghanistan or Iraq or anywhere else.
But, I mean, there have been cases of people coming out, whistleblowers about 9/11, that said that they just ignored threats. I mean, it wasn't really that we weren't capable to deal with the threats, is that they just didn't. I mean, they were either highly incompetent or criminally negligent in the case.
Well, I can't comment on that. That's beyond my level of expertise. All that I can tell you is that we can reduce defense spending, and we will. How we do it is very important, and that's, to me, the real question, because what Mr. Romney has said, what Mr. Obama has said about defense and foreign policy and other things, most of it is fiction.
What about the lobbying from defense contractors? Do you think that that will have an influence?
Well, the defense contractor can only do so much. I mean, we impute lots of bad things to the defense industries. We need a defense industry. We need the scientific industrial base that supports that defense industry. Technology is what confers tremendous power on our forces. So that's got to be preserved. The issue is, how much of it do we need, and how do we preserve that? So to treat the defense industry as somehow or another the culprit is ridiculous. They have ultimately been responding to the client. And it's back to what I said before. Most Americans haven't paid attention to where the money goes.
And how much money does go to the defense of our income taxes?
Well, you know, it's the largest portion of discretionary spending, and the percentages are debatable because, remember, it's not just defense. It also involves intelligence, and it involves many other things that don't even show up.
Like the CIA's black budget.
Well, the CIA, but, you know, we have a lot of construction overseas that doesn't even show up in these budgets. There are all sorts of things involved, so it's who knows, but I would not hesitate to say almost $1 trillion. That's going to be scaled back profoundly. Remember, when did the British leave India? They left after World War II when they couldn't afford to stay. They were broke. They should have left India 50 years earlier. It was in their interest to do so. They didn't. We're going to leave because we can't afford to stay overseas where we've been.
Well, it makes one wonder when this endless threat will be over, because we finally have to admit that we're broke and we can't sustain it anymore.
It's true.
That was Douglas Macgregor, retired U.S. Army colonel.